Well, thank you for joining us in our 5th Equity Fellows Forum. Before we begin, I'd just like to pay my respects to the country that I'm currently on. Today I'm located in the Darawal Nation, and I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional custodians of this land, the Wadi Wadi people. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to the Aboriginal community that continue to care for country. I stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language and history, and a continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights, paving the way for a strong future. Thank you so much for joining us today. As I mentioned, this is the 5th of 6 Fellows Forums that we've organised this year. My name is Sarah O'Shea. I'm the Director of the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education, which we call NESHE for short. NESHE is housed at Curtin University and is funded by the Commonwealth Government with a dedicated mission to improve the higher education outcomes, that is access, participation, retention, success and completion rates for marginalised and disadvantaged people. We do this through a variety of strategies, including research, practice and policy. One of the key programs that NESHE runs is the Equity Fellowship Programme. And today we have the great pleasure of introducing Associate Professor Tim Pitman, who was awarded a year-long Equity Fellowship to explore disability support in higher education, focusing on what our students are telling us. As you would be aware, this year has been particularly difficult for our fellows, with many of them experiencing varying levels of lockdown. We've taken a slightly different approach to this presentation and asked each of the fellows to prepare a short TED-style talk that focuses on a specific element of their research. This is followed then by a live Q&A session, which today will be facilitated by Louise Pollard, who is a leading expert in this field and also one of our previous Equity Fellows. And I'm going to pass over now so we can watch the short video that Tim has prepared. Thank you.
Hello. This recording was made on the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Here I want to share a little of what I have learned so far in my fellowship, which explores how universities can better support students with disability in their studies. A bit of background might help here. There are approximately 75,000 higher education students with disability in Australia. In fact, the actual number is certain to be higher because not all students choose to identify, but let's take that as a starting point. Of those 75,000, around 15,000 are in regional Australia. The most common types of disability recorded are mental health and medical conditions. Key to my fellowship has been prioritising the voice of students with disability. There is a saying in disability studies, nothing about us without us, and this has been central to my research design. The findings that I'm about to share with you come directly from the students via a national survey, followed up by more detailed conversations. Over 1,700 students participated in the survey, and several hundred have taken part in the follow-up stage. The response has been extraordinary, and I am incredibly grateful to all of them. Here's what they've shared with me so far. One type of support universities can offer is attitudinal. This refers to the way they treat their students with disability, behave around them. Overall, universities score quite well in this regard. They're seen as open and inclusive environments. However, this is sometimes because we don't see the disability, either because the student is studying online, or as some of them have described it to me, their disability is invisible. Universities can also support students with disability by implementing clear processes and procedures to let students know how and where they can receive support. Again, universities score quite well in this regard. Clear, regular and proactive communication is really appreciated. Less appreciated is when this support is impersonal, generic and slow to react. Technological support is about the software and hardware that universities can employ to assist students with their learning needs. Increasingly, students with disability are bringing their own solutions to universities, and they appreciate it when the institution is flexible enough to incorporate them into their own systems. Inclusive design principles are also helpful for many students with disability. For example, if all online lectures are provided with closed captions, then that's very useful, as opposed to requiring a student with disability to have to make a specific request. Built environment support is not just about ramps and lifts. It includes low-level noise environments, quiet spaces, and appropriate lighting levels. Universities are rated so-so in this respect. A strong theme that is emerging through my discussion with students is a need for more to be done in the area of inclusive design. Rather than make one room or one building or one unit of study in a course accessible, if we can design entire campuses or modes of delivery in this way, then all students, not just those with disabilities, will benefit. Social inclusion is as important for students with disability as those without, but unfortunately here, universities are not rated so well. The issue of neurodiversity is mentioned often here, in the sense that too many activities or events are organised on the assumption that all participants have equal levels of mobility or react to stressful and new environments in exactly the same way. The final type of support universities provide students with disabilities involves how they communicate with them, especially in the delivery of their teaching and learning. Again, the issue of neurodiversity is important here. We know that different students learn more effectively via different types and styles of instruction and communication. This includes things such as accessible web designs and alternative modes of content delivery and assessment. Unfortunately, it's here that universities receive the lowest ratings for support. There's a lot more I can and could discuss, including the particular issues faced by regional students or the effects the coronavirus pandemic has had on students with disability. These topics and more will be included fully in my final report. But for now, thank you very much for your time.
Well, I'm sure you'll agree that was a terrific presentation. Thank you so much, Tim. You provided just so much food for thought there, and I'm sure you're going to develop that now in the conversation with Louise. So I'm just going to remind everyone that we do have live Q&A. So if you have a question for Tim, I know that he'd be really happy to answer it. And I'm going to pass over to Tim and Louise to take it from here. Over to you two guys.
Thanks, Sarah. We really appreciate the introduction. As Sarah mentioned, my name's Louise Pollard. I was a 2017 Equity Fellow, and I'm the Director of Admissions and Student Services at the University of Notre, Australia in Fremantle. Like Tim, I'm standing on the land of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. Tim, that was a really interesting presentation, and I think a really good taster about what we're going to be seeing as your research develops and when you present your report and further findings. Can you just tell us a little bit about what brought you to this topic?
Yeah, sure. I've been involved in supporting students from disadvantaged backgrounds for over 20 years. I've been researching it for 10. In the last couple of years, I've really been able to focus more and more on students with disability because I've been very fortunate at the university I'm working with to be working and have learnt from a group of critical disability study researchers, a lot of them with lived experience of disability. And they've helped guide me in the way in which this research can be done. I was further supported by actually a previous Centre Fellow, Matt Brett, who also gave me some key insights to how this research could be done. What I needed was the opportunity, because in order to do this research properly, it needs to be done thoughtfully, and it needs to be done, as I've said, in a nothing about us without us environment where you can actually create an environment which students can and do choose to talk to you. And so I couldn't have done it without a centre. That's the kind of thing that you can't just do one day a week in your spare time and only pay it scant attention, and the centre being able to provide this opportunity to step back from all my other work and for a full year embed myself in this. So that's why for me this has been the perfect moment.
Excellent, thank you. And I agree with you full-heartedly about the value of the fellowship. Just being able to immerse yourself in a topic is it's a luxury and a privilege, and it's an amazing opportunity. One question's come through. Did students make any comments about placements or internships? How might they be made more inclusive? Thanks, Tony.
The only comments that I've seen were in relation to COVID, where students are getting very stressed and worried because of COVID. They were not able to do their placements and internships. So I don't actually have any insights into, in a normal, for want of a better word, a non-COVID word, what would happen there. So I wouldn't like to make any assumptions, but I am still collecting data, and maybe that's a question I can actually specifically ask of the students.
Another question has come in, oh, sorry, it's been covered by my screen for just a moment. From Liddell. She loves your snapshot. What proportion of your survey respondents said they had neurodiverse conditions? And the other, we had another question submitted just prior to this, also showing interest in the perspectives of neurodiverse students. So perhaps you could expand a bit on that.
Yep, neurodiversity is a big issue, and it's been a real eye-opener for me. The reason I'm looking like this is I'm trying wherever possible to find the voice of the students. So I've got a couple of quotes because I really do want their voices to come through. So the issue of neurodiversity has been absolutely critical because the students have said, when it comes to something like assessments or learning access plans, the universities are starting to, have understood, and they realise that there are different learning styles and different environments, and they can start to structure and deliver quite good experiences there. But what the students are telling us is that neurodiversity is it's everywhere. It's the way in which they're treated in social situations. It's just these assumptions that come. It's this hidden disability part of it, that even when there's a learning access plan, a lot of the rest of the university and its daily life, it assumes a certain neurotypicality. I'm just looking at one quote from one student that says that it also can spin the other way where assumptions are made. So this student, they didn't disclose to me exactly what disability they had, but it was an evident disability. Perhaps it was a physical disability, I'm not sure. But they said that because of that, they said they found people speaking to me very clearly and with exaggerated enunciating as if I'm hard of hearing. So you're either, and a couple of other comments the students have made is they're saying we're either treated as normal, or if we disclose some form of disability, we're completely not normal. And another student pointed out that they said taking biology with a genetic condition is confronting because all the language I'm confronted with in the textbooks includes phrases like mutated, abnormal, wrong, when I see my life as differences, just human variation. I thought it was really insightful because not necessarily calling for the textbooks to be changed, but we have to understand, and we have to have disability awareness training to understand that a learning access plan is just one thing. It's how we respond and behave to these people, and respond to and behave to everyone around us and realise there's so much diversity out there. I hope that's gone some way to answering the question.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it leads, you talked a lot about inclusive design in your presentation. And I imagine that will be, I suspect that will be a big thing moving forward.
Sure.
Another question has come in from Karen. Do you have a sense from universities of their willingness to implement recommendations for change resulting from your study?
Depends on what the recommendations are going to be, and also depends on who you're asking. There's incredible support from the disability support officers, the DSOs. They're advocates, they've been operating in this space, and they really want these things to happen. But when you look at the bigger pictures about things that really need to be done, that's when we're going to have to look for a step change. And I guess now is a good time to talk about one of the things that I think is going to be absolutely critical, and that's to more fully embrace universal design learning processes. So universal design learning principles basically say, when we design something, it can be a building, it can be a path, it can be a course, it can be a mode of instruction, it can be a software tool, it can be a hardware tool. Understand, getting back to the issue of neurodiversity and diversity overall, that different people engage with things in different ways, different people learn and respond better in different ways. So if we can build those into our systems, it means that there are going to be fewer times when students will have to step out of the day-to-day running and request special accommodations. It won't ever stop completely. There'll always be very specific circumstances that students will need special accommodations. But the more we can universally design our entire campuses and our ways of teaching, the less students will have to basically be out of their comfort zone and having to disclose and feel different and feel that they're causing a problem to have these things happen. That's a big one because we're talking about changing the whole infrastructure of universities, but ultimately that's the direction we have to go.
Absolutely. A couple of questions have come in around student assessment. What are some of the biggest issues in assessment, and how did you measure student views on whether assessments themselves are equitable for people with disability?
The main messages that came around assessment is, and this is where universities, you might have, if people might recall from the slides, the things universities actually score very highly on are procedures. When there's a procedure in place, particularly when that procedure is being directed by and led by the Disability Support Office, very good, relatively high levels of satisfaction overall. The problem is that assessment has to be delivered by somebody, a lecturer, an academic, a scholar, another person. And that's where we can start to see fractures, because the system is only as good as the person delivering it. I can actually give a personal perspective from this. It won't shine highly on me, but it really, I think, rams its home. Got to be 20 years ago now when I first came to university. One of my first jobs was in an exams department. And of course, we dealt with a lot of special assessments then. And I can still remember it. I can remember getting the call from one of the exam venues saying, we have a student with a particular mobility back issue and they need an ergonomic footrest. It's not here, it was supposed to be delivered. And I said, no worries, I'll grab it. Went to the storage area, grabbed it, went down, very proud of myself because I was sprinting. Got there, and I can still remember her saying, that's a bookrest, that's not a footrest. Because I didn't know what I was looking for, it vaguely looked right to me. She handled it with incredible grace, but it would have been incredibly stressful to her because she's just about to sit down and try and do an exam. So that was an example of there was a process, it had been recorded, there was a need for this, but then the people delivering the process, including me, fell down. That's one problem. The second problem, like I say, is that disability support officers generally, the students report, they're incredibly supportive and incredibly understanding, but then the lecturer in the class says, effectively is transmitting with their body language and sometimes outwardly, actively discriminating and saying, I don't think you should have this. I think this is an unfair advantage. I think this is wrong, which leads to a second thing. We need mandatory disability awareness training. We don't need people to be experts in understanding of how to support students with disability. That's what the DSOs can do. But everyone needs to understand that at least 75,000 students in our system have disability, and we need to be aware of and empathetic to their needs, not sympathetic, empathetic to their needs.
Thank you. Matt Brett is appreciative of the shout out you gave him, so thank you on behalf of Matt. And his question is inclusive design an educator's abstraction or well understood by students you've spoken to? Either way, how might we partner with students to make inclusive educational design the starting point rather than, all too frequent, an afterthought?
Matt, I hate you because you asked the questions I feel I can't answer. That's a very good question. The first part, I don't feel I yet have an understanding. It is, I suspect, what you're talking about there, and there is an intellectual understanding of what inclusive and universal design is, but we don't necessarily implement it. In terms of the students, the two things the students can give us, we absolutely need to incorporate them into the design, and here we need to incorporate all students because it needs to be student and learner centric. So it's basically how do we build this so that you actually get the best learning outcomes, and that's both for with students with and without disability. We can only do that in partnership with them. So we can start off with kind of like external abstractions of, I would imagine a universal design system would look like this. But a design process by its nature would have to then get the students and say, let's partner with you and work through the system, because you'll be able to say, you thought that was going to work and it doesn't. That kind of links to a second thing that I highlighted in the slide about technology. When universities 25 years ago started thinking about supporting students with disability, they imagined themselves as the solution makers. They imagined themselves as the experts and the technological experts, that they would build the machines and build the equipment that would solve the students' problems. We're now living in 2020 and the students increasingly are coming with their own solutions. Because often the market out there will deliver those solutions for them better. And what we need to do is say, we're not going to build a solution for you to let you study and learn better and feel more comfortable in our institution. You've already got the solution. We need to make our university, our system adapt to incorporate that solution.
Thank you. So Cara has submitted a question on the Q&A, and I encourage others to continue doing so. Some people did submit them previously, and Beck McKenzie is now adding them on. I've answered a couple of them, but any other questions coming in, please do so. Just type them in there. And also please feel free to vote for questions as well. Now, Cara's question is, let's just move up the screen because people are doing exactly what I asked. I know that people with disabilities in general are often hesitant to participate in research, and you had over 1,700 students participate in your research. Do you have any insights into who was most willing or able to participate?
I would say the demographics of the students exactly match the demographics that you get statistics from the government in terms of whether they fall into groups of students with physical mobilities, learning difficulties, medical conditions. So the simple answer there is just overwhelmingly they've agreed to participate. I haven't seen a particular, the survey participant statistics or demographics match up exactly with the national ones. So it hasn't been that a particular group of students have engaged with this, they just all have. Other than, that would probably be the thing. I don't think there's actually been a particular group of students. And I've just been overwhelmed by the response. I feel that this is something that they really want to hear their voices heard, and this has given them the opportunity.
Thank you. Another pre-submitted question. I'm particularly interested in the differences between student experiences for those with less visible, i.e. mental health learning challenges, and more visible disabilities, i.e. like wheelchair, visual impairment. Do you have any insight in this?
Yeah, there is some stuff coming through. I'll just bring up a couple of quotes here. Actually, before I get to the quotes, the interesting thing, because this mentions students the more visible disabilities, including visual impairment. The visual impairment group is actually quite interesting because the government recently published completion rate data, and across the whole student population, completion rates are around 73%. So about 73% of students complete their course in a given time. For students with disability, that drastically plummets down to 66%. However, the low vision blind category is also at 73%. They're an actual standout of a group who for a very long time advocated for support and engaged with universities and the DSOs and the external advocacy things to say, you need to deliver education in a way that we can access it. That's an example partly of a group, I feel, getting together and being very, having a really strong advocacy model, but also I'm trying to use words of advantage and disadvantage because that's very subjective, but that's one consequence of your disability being apparent. In other words, people can't overlook it. They can't deny it. They can't pretend it's not there. That presents two challenges. That's very good from a group perspective. So the group of students who identify as low vision or blinds, because they can rally around this and make action and change happen. But individual students within that group, and this is where it comes out, they regularly say, I'm sick and tired of having to be the advocate at my university. I'm sick and tired of having to be that person. And so students with obvious disability can sometimes find it incredibly draining and tiring because they can't escape that. The flip is true of being invisible. In many cases, it does give you extra agency and some choice. You can choose the time and the place in where to disclose. But as I said, the flip side of that is because it is not apparent to neurotypical people that you have disability, when you do suddenly ask for a learning assessment plan or an accommodation, there can be some resistance to that and some sense of, you don't need this, what's going on? So I think that's the main difference, is that I think that having, from the feedback, it would seem that having apparent disability can be very strong and powerful at the group level, but incredibly challenging and draining for individuals within that group.
Yeah. Cara's also interested, she talks here a little about, and you just mentioned it there, about some students providing you with feedback that they've regretted their disclosure to the university because of discriminatory attitudes. Can you speak to the characteristics of these circumstances?
I can't speak to the characteristics because they're incredibly individual, and I have to say, have made at times for very confronting and emotional reading. So it's a good example, and I kind of want to tie in something, a couple of those, like again, when you're going through the slides and you speak to somebody who's not understanding or really engaged in the student with disability area, the initial take home is you go, oh, like 80 odd % of students are very happy with these kinds of support that they get. That's really good. And sure, it'd be good if you were at a McDonald's and you're looking at, like how people are happy with my service, or you were buying a car or buying a smartphone. But what we've got to remember is even a very small percentage of students who are dissatisfied, within that group, we are talking about, in many cases, absolutely discriminatory behaviour. Stuff that contravenes, the Disability Discrimination Act at times, and that can be destroying. I won't talk them out here because they are very confronting, and there's a couple of case studies that I'm going to put in the report verbatim. And what they show, well, what one shows, so I'll just speak from memory because, like I say, I don't want to use this language because I think it is very personal to this kind of a talk. The first one describes a really cascading situation where things start well. And again, you think about the DSO as being the centre, and as the students, the effect of the Learning Access Plan radiates out and out and out, and the people further away from the DSO become more and more engaged, but less and less able to understand the situation, the pressure starts to accumulate on the student. And like I said, this is the paradox. The DSOs have specific training, they understand these things, they can put into place very good plans, but they are reliant on the academics, the teaching staff, the admin staff to support the students, and they're the ones without the experience. One situation can then cause an incredible stress and anxiety. It then triggers an event in the student and adds to their stress and anxiety, which requires them to do modifications to their learning access plan, which then generates within the academic even more suspicion. And really, I think you're now trying it on, and it becomes this vicious cycle. Then what happens in this particular case is the student, for self-preservation, to look after themselves, withdraws, looks after their mental health, then re-engages, and then they are told, well, you've failed the unit, you've passed the deadline date. This then triggers a next level of cascading anxiety. They then miss out on another assessment, and at this point the university says, you just need to withdraw from the course. So that can be incredibly confronting there. I have another case, I must say this is a rarity, but there's another case where a student clearly is describing just systematic failure. The whole system from the DSO out fails. Like I say, the thing about these situations are, and this is the thing we need to do at the university level. You could, for example, if I could present if this podcast is recorded and say sent to someone very senior at a university, they have two choices. They can look at those statistics I presented at the start and go, 8 out of 10 students happy. I think we're doing a very good job here, business as usual. Or they can look at the very specific cases in which the system has clearly failed and been discriminatory and said, no, we need to change.
Yeah, the student voice is incredibly powerful, but it can be very distressing, some of those experiences. But in many ways, we need to have an understanding or appreciation of those stories if we want change to happen, especially going back to Karen's question there around universities being willing to implement recommendations for change.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And Marin's actually just posted a comment in the chat, just talking about being worried that access plans are an invitation for conscious and unconscious bias. Yeah. Another question then is moving more about the research and your participants. Were many high degree by research students? And are these often, as these are often forgotten about in research, this is often a forgotten group of students. From Rachel.
HDR students are in many ways a forgotten group. There have been some responses from HDR students, and I don't know if this is necessarily typical of the HDR, but what I found interesting from a couple of them was they said, I actually feel being a mature age person and being a second, when I say second, as in my second degree learner, actually makes me feel more isolated from the campus than having disability, because they're seeing all these undergraduates. I'm pretty sure the one used the expression bright and bushy-tailed, undergraduates running around, and they feel that separates them more. So I can't give you any specific insights into that. There have been some responses from HDR students, but the actual things they're talking about mirror the same issues that the undergraduate students are talking about: connectivity, both technological and social, with their institutions, for example.
Thank you. Another pre-submitted question was regarding the experience of regional students. I want to broaden that to regional and remote students. But before answering that question, there's such diversity within regional remote students engaged in higher education. Online students, as well as students like relocating or studying in a regional university centre. How did you find with the online students studying online? Were many students studying online from regional remote areas engaged in your research?
Yeah, so I had specific questions, and I asked them to contextualise that, because as you've said, there's actually three ways of looking at regionality. I'll just say regional to just encompass regional, remote, rural. It's just easier to say. But as you say, you can be a regional student living in regional Australia and studying at a regional university. You can be a regional student living in regional Australia but studying online at a metropolitan, and you can be a regional student relocating to metropolitan, and each of them have specific issues. Looking, again, one of the few times I'll talk to the stats, looking at the stats, regional students with disability, you have kind of like a gradation. So, for example, in the overall student population, there's a slight bias towards female enrolments. For students with disability, the biases are slightly stronger, and for regional students with disability, even more so. Exactly the same for mature age. Students with disability slightly more tend to be mature age than the overall population, regional even more so. Same for part-time and same for online. In terms of types of disability, exactly the same profile. In terms of satisfaction, those slides that I started off with, exactly the same profile. But then we move to the specific issues. And looking at the responses that we got around this and looking at it thematically, the main issue was lack of access or travel for specialist care services. That is a big thing. Here's a quote from one student that is very typical. I can travel up to 2 hours one way to attend specialist appointments based in Metro Australia, up to 2 times a month. Obviously, having a disability is time consuming enough, but then you add in the extra time, and it's even more of a setback when I'm trying to then match that with my university and work commitments. So universities can sometimes think that's got nothing to do with this, that's specialist services, that's the NDIS. And in some ways, yes, it is. But again, getting back to the notion of universal design learning principles, you have to accept that this student has these massive commitments, and it's not just the 2 hours there and the 2 hours back, it's then the exhaustion that follows that and the disruption to their life. So we have to be more aware that students that live in regional Australia, many of them have to expend significant resources to access the services they need. The second thing, the digital divide, and here a couple have made specific mention of how important the regional university centres have been. I was listening to the podcasts, the webinars all throughout the weekend. I think Nicole talked about this and Janine talked about this. These regional university centres are a boon and a godsend to some students. Another issue that people may not consider because they think, oh, you know, you've got a regional university next year, yes, but not all, most regional universities don't have the same choice of courses that the metro universities do. That then gives that student 2 options. One is to study online, and we can have whole conversations about online, offline, online. For some students, that works really, really well, and that's actually their preference, but for other students, that's incredibly challenging for other reasons, many of them related to their disability. And so some of them, if they're really passionate about a particular course, they then have to relocate to Metro Australia, and that brings in a whole range of support issues. The final thing that I found really interesting, with one notable exception, was overall, the students said that the sense of community in regional Australia and the regional universities was really, really important to them. Helped them stay grounded, helped them feel that they could engage in their study with much less anxiety. Here's a quote from one student. They said, an advantage of studying at a regional university is there's less students, So therefore I find the staff I need assistance from are generally able to return my calls or emails promptly, and they have time to meet with me when it suits me. Another advantage is that there's a relaxed atmosphere on campus at my uni. I really appreciate this because there's nothing worse than feeling pressure to attend certain events or get involved in activities when you're having a particularly difficult day or week. So that comment there, that quote there was typical of quite a few students. But like I said, one notable exception was one student did say that they hated being in regional Australia because they'd grown up in this small community and they had been stereotyped and typecast as that kid. And they actually felt that they wished that they weren't there, but that was an exception.
Very excellent. And it'd be remiss of me not to mention it, but for those in more remote areas, even getting access to those regional university centres can be quite challenging, especially in places like Western Australia. With the tyranny of distance the way it is, there's a lot of places where it's just not necessarily as easy to put in one of those hubs.
Yeah,
but saying that, it's seen looking at going to a symposium that this centre hosted last year or the year before with the regional university, like the new study hubs. It's amazing what's been happening when it's been driven by the university, by the community themselves.
Yep.
Anyway, I digress. Jacinta has raised, she's had a young student with mental health issues who did not want to register with disability service due to the word disability. In your interviews or from what you've read or from the students you've spoken to, is there a movement to rename disability services to such, for example, accessibility services?
I've not seen any evidence of that. That said, it wasn't a specific question I asked. Like I say, all you can do is be consistent. So in terms of this whole way in which I've understand this methodology, I think it was very clear from the beginning that with the students that I would use the expression student with disability, and the participants basically locked in, okay, that's how Tim's talking about it. And there's incredible resilience, obviously, within this community of people who are just used to being spoken to in a certain way. So I don't know, but it wasn't a particular question that I asked, so I couldn't be sure. I also, just as an aside here, there's some very interesting stuff happening also within these groups, that when they look at the responses from other people, they're saying, oh, I wouldn't have classified that as a disability necessarily, or I wouldn't have looked at it this way. And that gets back to, again, this constant desire to typecast and classify and categorize. A world as a social scientist that I've come from, because that's how policy works. Let's identify a group and test the bejesus out of them and then make policy changes. And increasingly, these people are saying, don't talk about classification and labels and things, just talk about functional requirements. Like, this is how I learn best. This is the environment in which I'm least anxious. Create this environment for me. Sorry, can I just quickly slightly digress, only because I've been half tracking the questions, and I noticed that some anonymous person said, were there any insights on students with disability completing their degree than the university providing support for employment? The very next podcast, my colleague David Eckstein, that's his entire fellowship. So basically tune in just over an hour's time and you should get a wealth of information on that.
Very nice promo for David. Thank you. Going back to actually talking about employability, yep. Nadine Zacharias has pointed out that will is very big at the moment in university, universities are putting in investing significantly in will and have it as a huge priority. You spoke before about university staff, regardless of what area they're in, having training and having a greater understanding of providing appropriate support. How do we engage as a sector with employers in that space when we're encouraging students to engage in will? Did that come up at all, or have you had any insights into that?
So there's by way of background and methodology, just so you know, again, my colleague David is presenting after this one. As I said, it's been an incredible privilege hearing these voices from these students, and David and I made the conscious decision, we don't want to go out, and I don't want to go and ask these students to give me all this valuable information, and then a week later David re-engages with them and asks. So we actually did a joint survey. So that's why I'm saying, actually, all that stuff I've deliberately not looked at because he's the expert on it. So I'm not dodging it, I'm just saying David will be able to cover this. One thing I would say, separate to the survey and separate to what David's going to say later on in the day around that, I was really having a very interesting conversation with another person who's been fantastic in guiding me, Darlene McLennan from University of Tasmania. She's just integral to ADSET. And she was helping me work through the complexities of the NDIS and its engagement with universities. And it's convoluted. It's that point at which, because generally speaking, the NDIS is imagined as outside the university. This is all the support you get. And then you come to the university, and that's when the university becomes responsible. But will is an area where there's that grey area because the student is not really in there, and it can get incredibly bureaucratic and complex. Like if there's a placement at this particular place, and all our students are required to go there, then the NDIS can pay for that student's taxi vouchers because. So in this situation, the person can get support from the NDIS, but in a different situation, if the university just structures the will in a different way, the NDIS no longer counts in this university, and even the universities can get confused about, is it our responsibility, the NDIS?
Okay, we've got time for one or two more questions. Jackie's asking specifically about COVID. Like when you and I were speaking earlier, you mentioned that a lot of your survey questions were being asked around May through to July. Was that right?
That's
a pivotal
right.
Time, and with great difference in experience across the country.
Yep.
Any themes emerge from that, positive and negative impact on classes, on teaching and learning, and also assessments being online?
So, okay, so here are the clear themes that came out. Well, here's a few of them, not necessarily in order because I'm mixing around a bit in my head. I know a constant theme that came out was students saying, for years I've been asking to be able to study online because it's much better for my particular circumstances, and the universities have said it's not possible. Suddenly it became possible. So it's, it's that whole will. Kind of gets back to that earlier question, what do we require? God forbid that we require a pandemic to make universities move, but sometimes it requires that meta crisis in order for universities to suddenly go, hey, this is possible. That said, the students, just sticking currently with the method of instruction, it's almost split down the line. There have been some students who have said, this suits me. And in fact, they've said, I was studying this way anyway. My disability meant that I was studying this way anyway, so it was business as usual for me. Others were saying it actually has now improved. For every one student that says that, there's another student that is really, really missing the structure and the engagement. The key themes is that it's more flexible, however, it's less structured and it's harder to stay motivated. Those things are probably, I think, even students with and without disability would probably say the same. More specifically on disability, some really interesting stuff. Like I love this quote by this person. They said, I chose to study on campus as a form of exposure therapy. I have PTSD. I have symptoms of anxiety. I deliberately chose to study on campus to intentionally put myself into situations to cause anxiety. It's incredible like self-agency there. This allows me the opportunity to utilize the coping strategies that I've been learning through my therapy. And then COVID came along and I've lost all those opportunities. So I'm desperate to get back to put myself under my controlled pressure again. I found that was really interesting, not necessarily typical, but very interesting. The other main thing, the next main theme coming through is that in terms of moving online because of COVID, the overwhelming kind of like the general response from the students participating have said, the universities moved more or less very, very well, and they did a really good job. And the students themselves here are quite sympathetic. They're saying, we realized you had to just do this so quickly. However, as it's gone on, it's been quite clear that there are not the systems in place to maintain this, and they're starting to see their service fracture and fragment and start to break down. So the students have been very complimentary of the initial response to COVID, but the longer it's going, the more it's showing that this is not a long-term solution. I get back to that UDL, the Universal Design Learning. If we've actually embedded it systematically, it would work better. And the final thing that came out is, it's not directly related to universities, but universities need to be aware of this because it makes such an impact, is for many students, a lot of these students have they're in really high-risk groups. They have autoimmune issues, and so they're trapped in their houses. And so even as other students are maybe starting to re-engage more, they feel incredibly pressured and still locked away. Obviously, Victoria itself has been a big challenge for a lot of students with disability. And so they're saying access to specialist services and being worried about going out, this is all increasing their anxiety and stress, and universities need to be aware. It's not just them, their change to their processes, which is putting stress on the students, but there's this massive amount of stress just flowing around the system.
Yeah, absolutely. And how did you find that COVID impacted your research? Because you set out, this was all set up pre-COVID.
Yeah.
There was a research plan. You would have had thoughts about how you were going to do it. How did that change?
The major thing it changed is I wanted the design to be as inclusive as possible. So for instance, emails work very good for some students. However, for other students, face-to-face is much more prepared, and that opportunity was lost to me. And the reality is within the time frame and the current world, COVID is lingering, unfortunately, is probably going to be an opportunity lost now. That's a real shame. So I'm aware that even while I'm privileging and prioritising student voices, I acknowledge and accept that there are other student voices who couldn't engage because email was not appropriate for them. I also, in some limited cases, tried to do Zoom, but again, some students, and they've said, they basically, in a couple of cases said, my whole life is Zoom, I don't want to do another one with you. And others have said, it really stresses me, it really puts me. So in terms of the number of responses, I've been overwhelmed and gratified, but I acknowledge and recognise that there are certain groups of students with disability who have lost out because of COVID.
Yeah, thank you. And final one from Matt. From what you've gleaned so far, what additional research questions are emerging from your work? What's next for you and the broader range of people interested in this domain?
There's a couple of things that, as I've said, I'm intrigued about how we take universal design learning to the next stage, about how we actually embed this, incorporate this in a whole way. And I personally believe that the way forward there is to not make it an issue about students with disability, but just to make it a universal issue about how universities of the 21st century can actually be the most flexible and adaptive and respond to a wide range of student learning styles and student learning needs. And then everyone benefits from that. That's the first one. The second one is we need to work out how we can systemically provide disability awareness training for all staff at universities and make sure that that training is properly designed, understood in a way that they'll actually engage with it. It can't just be a tick box that every staff member does this module and says, tick, that's done. It has to be something that actually engages them and makes them understand. The final thing, and I was again a little bit stunned going into this, was I thought it'd be quite easy to understand how much universities spend supporting students with disability, but it is really hard to find out because it just impacts on so many areas. There's some parts which are really obvious. For example, requests that universities make to the government to get refunds on specialist equipment that they've purchased. But that's only a fraction of it. And you could quantify like how many disability support officers there were in your university and what their salaries were. But again, that doesn't, it's everything. It's from like the library to the catering outlets, to the landscaping, to everything. So trying to work out exactly how much this costs is I think really important because we need to get that out there to make people understand how important this is.
Yeah, it's amazing that it's been so challenging to find. But it makes sense. It's all in the different pots or different areas. Any final thoughts? What do you want participants here to take away? What were their final messages that you would like people to take from this webinar?
I think I've covered it. I'll just keep it simple. Let's just focus on two things. Let's speaking to the university community here, let's embed and make mandatory disability awareness training for everyone so that we understand everyone has at least a passing knowledge or a basic understanding of how to understand the situation. That's the first one. And let's start having some serious conversations around universal design learning principles.
Excellent, thank you. And when do you think we'll be able to see the next stage or further your findings from your research this year?
Very much hope to submit them by the end of the year. That will be a report submitted to the government and through the centre. And then what I'm really looking forward to is engaging and continue to engage with the centre all throughout next year to get that message out, to start saying who needs to hear the message, what part of the message they need to hear, what's the format in which they need to hear. So it's going to, I'm really looking forward to next year.
Excellent. I don't think you're alone in looking forward to next year, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm going to thank you so much, Tim. I found that really insightful. There's a lot of food for thought for me within my own context, and I hope everyone listening was able to take something away from it, from their own perspective and their own context too. Sarah, over to you.
Oh, look, thank you so much, Louise and Tim. Wow, that was a huge Q&A there. We had some terrific engagement from everyone, all the participants, and Louise, well done for dealing with those questions, because for anyone who's ever hosted a webinar, it is tricky. You've got questions coming in and then people voting for them. All up, I think you managed to get through about 18 or 20 questions, so well done. And well done to you, Tim, for answering them all as well and doing so well in presenting your research. I'm conscious of time, but just before we finish, I just want to remind everyone that more details of the fellows are available on the NESHE webpage. And for those of you who aren't familiar with our website, I am just putting up the details of the website here, our email, our Twitter and Facebook accounts. Please do remember that Tim's research will also be published towards the end of the year. And we hope to have his report available in early 2021. As Tim mentioned as well, we do have David Eckstein coming up in our next and final webinar of the week. And David's webinar will be facilitated by Matt Brett, who I know is also in the audience today. So again, thank you both so much for taking the time today to come and participate in the Equity Snapshot Forum. And I look forward to seeing some of you at our next session later on in the day. Thank you, Tim and Louise.